Hello, everyone, and welcome to CL 100 Great Ideas of Politics and Ethics. It's an honor and great joy to read these books alongside you and discuss these great ideas and these seminal books and authors. Well, we'll read excerpts of some of the books, and some of the books we'll read in their totality. But without further ado, let's jump into Plato's Republic, which is the first book we'll be reading. As you know, next week we'll talk about other two dialogues by Plato, Up the Apology and Crito. And you see the book covers of the books we'll be looking at during this semester. And you could either use these versions here, of course, or if you'd rather use other versions such as the one I provided, that's also fine. But okay, let's start. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the historical context. So there's a timeline here, and you see 500 BC, and that's just to provide a broad indication of the period we're talking about. So the Republic was set somewhere around 420 BC. All right, so somewhere around here. Obviously, Plato would have been 9 years old, but he's writing the Republic much later and then talking about a period when he would be young, right? He's not a participant in the story. So as you know, Socrates is one of the main characters of the Republic, and when Plato wrote the Republic, Socrates would already have been dead, so he's talking about an earlier period of Athens around the year 425 BC or so, right? When he was a child, of course. Now, it's quite a feat of, in the history of political philosophy and philosophy more generally, that you'd have three major intellectuals in the history of the world, namely Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, being one the teacher of the other, right? So Socrates was the master or teacher of Plato, and then Plato would be the teacher of Aristotle. You also have Alexander the Great, which was not a philosopher, was a conqueror, as you know, but he also learned from Aristotle. So if you wanted to even go a fourth very significant person in the history of the world, right, which benefit from this sequence here, you could even include Alexander the Great, but he's not a philosopher and we're not going to talk about him much, but just wanted you to know this interesting fact that he was that Aristotle was his tutor when he was young. So part of the Republic is based on this idea that a good conqueror should also, or the great leader should also learn ethics and moral philosophy, etc. Right. So first you learn ethics, so you can learn politics or how to govern. That's the premise of the Republic, and that was part of what the political leaders of the time thought of. So they would educate their kids and in philosophy as well. And that's what happened with Alexander the Great. So he was prepared from a young age to be a great leader, and he learned from Aristotle because he was a great mind, and he thought that would contribute to his upbringing and political success and his ability to be a great leader, right? Not just not just a conqueror, right? Not just the ability to dominate other countries, but the ability, of course, to institute the right political conditions, right? Once you get there. All right. Now, Plato would have met Socrates when he was a young man, around 20, and Socrates would be around 60. As you've noticed from the first screen, we have Plato, the Republic of Plato, right? And then you have text on Socrates, but they were not written by Socrates, right? They were written by Plato and Aristophanes, this version at least. So you have multiple texts about Socrates, but there's no text written by Socrates, right? Why is it that we're sort of ignoring Socrates here? Why aren't we reading him? Well, because he didn't actually write a book or anything or text, right? He was of this oral tradition. It would be Plato and Aristotle who would write down these great ideas that obviously they learned from Socrates, but they also changed them and made them their own. But while Plato and Aristotle would write down books, and we can read his books, Socrates, on the other hand, he didn't write anything down. So that's why we're not reading him directly, but we are reading him indirectly because these dialogues are supposed to represent Socrates somehow, right? We never know exactly to what extent the Socrates, the character in the Republic, and also on the other dialogues, the dialogues written by Plato, we never know if Socrates is just a character or if that's an exact representation of Socrates the philosopher, right? We're led to believe that it should be quite close to what Socrates actually was like, so that the character should represent the philosopher to a great extent, but it's impossible to tell to what extent, right? So obviously, there's some space for creativity, and when Plato is using Socrates, he may add some of his ideas, or even if he's not trying to add his ideas, he's always going to be interpreting Socrates, right? Although obviously he learned from him and he spent so much time learning from him. At the end of the day, it's still right Plato who is telling you Socrates' idea, not Socrates himself. So there's some translation, right? There's another person telling you, and ideas get a little bit modified in the process. So that's all for you to understand that there's the character Socrates, which I believe is quite similar and close to the philosopher Socrates, but we just don't know exactly how precise those descriptions are. All right. Now, Plato then would be, as I mentioned, the teacher of Aristotle. We're not going to talk a lot about this because we're not even reading Aristotle. We're not going to discuss, obviously, Alexander the Great, but here's just the big picture, the panorama, where he's located and the intellectual tradition, right? He's part of. Now, there's two very, very important events during Plato's life that would shape his thought and that help to understand the republic, right? So I want to set the republic against these two things that happen, and that's the context, and that those two things make it easier for you to understand the republic. What are those things? Number one is the death of Socrates. So next week we're going to talk about the apology, right? And the apology is the trial of Socrates, and he gets trialed to death. You can see here on this nice picture by Jacques-Louis David, the death of Socrates, where he's about to drink the hemlock, right? So we'll talk about that later, but here's Socrates about to drink the poison, and you see his students and yeah, his students and friends, yeah, in great, sadness and crying, etc. Um, and obviously, as his professor and someone who Plato deeply admired, the death of Socrates was very impactful in his work because at the point, so let's go to the next slide here. I'll explain in a second why, but at the point, Athens was a democracy. Okay, so the second event, which is the Peloponnesian War, you can see here, the Peloponnesian War runs from 431 to 404. So it ends at 404, meaning that Socrates would have died a few years later, right? 399, as you can see. So 5 years later, right? So Socrates died after the Peloponnesian War, because during this period here, there was a period of oligarchy with the tyrants. We'll talk about that in a second. But my point is, during this period of the Peloponnesian War, which was also very important, there was a period where Athens was conquered by Sparta, and there was a tyranny there implemented, right? but that was during Socrates' life. So after Athens went back to being a democracy and things went back to normality, that's when Socrates was trialed, right? So he wasn't killed by a tyrant, he was killed by a democratic institution, right? Um, the people of Athens have, the citizens of Athens have voted and they chose to kill Socrates, right? So that's where Plato's dislike of democracy, which we'll talk about later, also comes from. All right. And the second one is Peloponnesian War, which, as I mentioned, ended up with the conquest of Athens for a very short period of around a year. But notice that Plato was born in 429, and that's 2 years after the Peloponnesian War started, right? So the first 20 years or so, or 30 years of his life, 25 years of his life, Plato was, growing up under this um, in period of immense political turmoil, when Athens would crumble, right? I mean, not come to the ground or be burned or anything like that, but it would be dominated by Sparta. So Athens, Plato was born at the golden age of ancient Athens, right? But precisely at that point, a war would start, which, right, would end with Athens being dominated. So it's as if Plato was born in the center of the world, as it were, a place of intense intellectual debate and economic activity, etc. But then, right, that starts to crumble. So his empire is shaking, right? So he's trying to understand why is it that Athens can't keep its power as it will maintain its glory, right? How could we set the republic, right, the political institutions to make sure our empire lasts, right, longer as it were. All right, now so the geopolitics a little bit. So just so you understand what we're talking about, this Peloponnesian War it refers to a part of Greece, which is the Peloponnese, which is the southern part of it, which is the part where you had Sparta. Okay, and that's not where Athens is located. So Athens is at central Greece, right? The blue region here in the map. So you see all the regions um, of Greece. You have Macedonia at the north. That's where Alexander the Great came from, right? And Aristotle would move to Macedonia to become tutor of, Alexander the Great, and the great empire of Alexander starts from Macedonia, and obviously it would spread all over the Middle East, and it was huge, right? Um, it would conquer most of the known world, right? And I mean, everything that it was, we're speaking about 400 BC, so it was very, very um, important, big, took over the major civilizations of the time. Okay, and uh, and here you see, and obviously I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, but it's just so you understand that during these 27 years or so, there was intense battle between these two factions, right? The Athens versus Sparta story. So Sparta being the blue here, and Athens being the red. So one thing you obviously notice here is that Athens is spread all around the Aegean Sea, and Athens is usually known as a naval empire. You see how they run more, right, expeditions and dominated all across, whereas Sparta is known more as a territorial as opposed to a naval or right or maritime empire. And you see how they conquered most of the land. And as I said, eventually they would conquer for a very brief period Athens as well. But they haven't established as many colonies, right, in other parts. You see also the Persian Empire, which would eventually be dominated by Alexander the Great. And then also you see other empires, right? Parts of what would be Italy, later on Crete, that which is now part of Greece, but not back then, and other parts of Greece here, which will become Greece, right, in the future, but weren't back here. Okay, so as I mentioned, eventually the Spartans do occupy Athens, right? And this is the period of the so-called 30 tyrants. Now, we will read about the 30 tyrants a little bit next week as well. They don't get mentioned. We're not going to talk about them much now, but for that year, for a little bit, a year and a half or so, on that last year of the Peloponnesian War, the 30 tyrants dominated Athens, and they killed 1,500 of its population, which was 5% of the population. So quite a massacre. They would dominate for they would kill people, without obviously trial or anything, for any reason they please. I mean, they were, an oligarchy, authoritarian regime, and they were known as the 30 tyrants. So again, trying to explain that when Plato writes the Republic, right, he's experienced both a republic, right, that was not able to hold to up to this regime, to these 30 tyrants, and then um, the republic, the demo, right, is reconstituted, and the tyrants are, finally expelled, but uh, unfortunately during this republic, this democracy, right? Socrates, his master, or his professor, gets killed, and therefore, um, you know, obviously is going to say, okay, there's something wrong with this democratic system that we have, right? If Socrates gets killed, then there's something we have to do about it. We have to change it. And that's what he's looking at, right? So here's the whole timeline of his event, of his life, just so you have a whole picture of the things we've been talking about. So just you see here clearly that Socrates' death is after the 30 Tyrants episode, 5 years after. So during that period when Athens was a democracy. This is very, very important, and I repeated this a few times because you'll be surprised by Plato, not and Socrates as well, not being fans of democracy, right? I mean, giving what nowadays we think democracy is the best possible system. So why would people that we respect so much and they're so great intellectuals, why would they be against democracy, right? Well, because democracy back then was not the same thing as a democracy now, right? We call it the same thing, but it wasn't the same thing. And the way it worked, I mean, for one, you still had slaves in ancient Greece, right? So it's the democracy, but not really, because you had slaves there. But it's a democracy in some respects, right? Right? You had political institutions. For instance, Socrates was trialed, right? So there were 500 people there, and we're going to talk about that again later, but there were people who voted for it, right? Just like we have a public trial nowadays. So to that extent, it was a democracy. It wasn't that, the powerful just determined that Socrates would die, right? He would go through process. He would be tried and go through due process. So to that extent, it was a democracy. But on the other hand, there was slavery. Um, so that's it's not so surprising that they would be against democracy, considering what happened to Socrates, right? That's the point I'm trying to make here. Um, and the Syracuse experiment, I'm not going to talk about it much, but Syracuse is in Sicily. Let me just show you here in the map in case you don't know. So you see here in Sicily, Syracuse, and there's this funny story, fun fact about um, uh, Plato, that he would go to Syracuse later on his life and try to apply the Republic. To put it in practice, okay, when he was rather old, as you can see, 388, towards the end, later part of his life, But so he was he met a tyrant over there in Syracuse, and he tried to, put into action the ideas of the Republic. He thought he could nudge this tyrant into building Syracuse, okay, according to his ideas, right? On his own ideas. And he moved to Syracuse, so to the south of Italy and Sicily, right? And started working with this tyrant, trying to convince him, right, of building Syracuse according to his own ideas. But the funny and kind of tragic story here, and that's why it's a fun fact, is that eventually he was actually sold into slavery by this very tyrant, right? So Plato thought he had the perfect system and he tried to implement it, but at some point the tyrant just goes, you know that guy, I'm tired of him, I have no use for him anymore, and he sold him as a slave, right? Um, or I'm obviously like simplifying the story. He may have gotten afraid of Plato's political ideas and of Plato trying to take over, right, command, etc. And he might have been threatened by Plato or whatever, and that's why he's sold him into slavery. But Plato had this uh, tragic episode also at the later part of his life, short-lived as well. He got off, fortunately, he got out of it rather soon. Um, but what you can see here is, as opposed to a very, quiet and peaceful life of the philosopher that I think we usually imagine when we're thinking about ancient Greece, isn't it? At least when I was young, before I, of course, read these great, great books and learned about philosophy when I was young. The first time I heard of Socrates and, these ideas, I always pictured, the very quiet times, people having these, peaceful debates about the meaning of things, etc. But I never pictured when I was young, and that there would be a lot of war and action going on and political turmoil, that the political institution would change so much from a republic to an oligarchy with the tyrants and then back again to the republic. Um, and then, Athens, actually, the glory of Athens would be right before Plato, right? So around Socrates' time, that's more of the golden age of Athens. But when Plato lives, that's actually when it's about to, come to an end to some extent. Well, it's true that there's Alexander the Great, and, his empire will expand a lot. But in terms of Athens and the golden age of, these philosophers, etc., that's when um, things are, it's not the golden age, right? But a little bit after it, I would argue. All right. Okay, so now what about the book itself? And this context that I was providing, right? Now there's the word stasis that you see here, the Greek word stasis, that means something like tension, political strife, something like that, political turmoil. That's a word that if you read on the original, it appears over and over in every chapter or book of the Republic, but one. It appears, or two. It appears 8 times in the Republic, if I remember correctly. So you find that word over and over again, right? So the whole context of the tyrant, 30 tyrants, and the Peloponnesian War, etc., all of that, you can see that clearly, even in the language used by the Republic, right? That's what's going on, right? That's what Plato is trying to answer to. That's the context. Short comment here on this cover, you can see Alan Bloom. So, as I mentioned, I shared with you a free version of the book, which is available online. There's the Gutenberg project, which makes lots and lots of books freely available, these classic books. So that's great. So that's why I shared the book with you. So you don't necessarily have to buy it, but if you want to go to the library and find a copy written by or translated rather by Alan Bloom or by Least Copy. This is the highest quality translation you can find of Plato, Plato's Republic, and that's the book I would recommend. Right, you don't have to use it, but if you want to understand Plato in greater detail, you see, for instance, I'm making this comment about stasis and how that is related to political strife, etc. Right now, the point is that different translations, right, will use different words, and some of them obviously will be more loyal, right, to the original Greek, while others won't. So in terms of understanding the main ideas of the book and that you can use any translation, I would argue, but the deeper you want to understand the book and the deeper you want to go here, the more I would recommend that you use, right, this book, this version here. Okay, so again, in other terms, we're going to talk about that more later. I mean, I'm going to get back to this point I want to make now because it's very important. But the goal, right, of the Republic and the influence that the context, the historical context has on Plato, is that Plato is trying to find a solution, right, to the stasis, okay, the political strife, right? He's saying, well, the republic, the way we have it at least, right? His republic, not the one we have in the United States and right in the 21st century, but the republic in 400 BC, he said, okay, that doesn't work. So how do we build a perfect state? He wouldn't call it a perfect state, right? But how do we call, um, uh, 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 how do we create this city? You will call it a city, of course, because we're thinking about Athens and the idea of city state, right? So he's not going to call it a state, but how do we create this order that will allow people to live happy lives and to be virtuous and to be just and to just be themselves without being threatened by the state, as happened with Socrates just because he, wanted to be a philosopher, right? How do we build a system where people can be philosophers, for instance, because that people couldn't apparently in Athens, right? I mean, it's not that they couldn't. Obviously, that's where philosophy comes from. But the point I'm making is, depending on of what kind of philosophical arguments you made, as we'll see, you would be trial to death. That's what happened to Socrates, right? So there wasn't free speech and full liberty to argue for philosophical ideas. There were certain limits, right? And that's what Plato is responding to. He's trying to create a perfect system where people would be, freer and then they were at least. Okay, so what is the Republic about? The most common answer will be it's about justice. Okay, it's definitely trying to answer to what is a just society, what is a just individual, right? So these two things are completely connected in his eyes. Trying to understand what is justice, Socrates keeps talking about this over and over with the interlocutors that he's going to meet. They're going to discuss different visions of justice, different conceptions of it. And yeah, so what does it mean to live a good life, a virtuous life, an excellent one, right? A just one. That's the main answer to the question of what the Republic is about. But you can also answer that um, that it's about politics. Okay, right. I was arguing previously that he's trying to make a just city, which will create the possibility of citizens to be virtuous, right? To be themselves, to be free, etc. So it's about justice, right? But it's also about politics, obviously. It's called the Republic. When you think about the title itself signals that there's a political element here, right? You don't know that the book is about justice when you just read the title, The Republic of Plato. You think, yeah, it's about the political order of the city, right? Now, when I say city, we just think about we just think, just use the word country in your mind, right? Or state instead of city. But Plato will use the word city, and we will use the word state or country, right? Replacing the city. So how to build this a just city, right? A city with good institutions, which allow individuals to be just, right? So point one and two are completely connected. That will be the conclusion of this lecture. But that's the idea that you have just individuals and just a just society or a just state, right? So just one point here I wanted to make also about justice, and we're going to get back to this, but it is about justice, but not about the justice system, right? It's about justice in this very broad sense of morality, what is correct. So even in the absence of written laws in a justice system, there would still be justice in Plato's sense. Justice here is what is the correct thing, the morally right thing to do, right? But we'll get back to this. Okay. And there's other things. So Rousseau famously argued that the Republic of Plato was the most important treatise in education. So, because it will talk about the education of the philosopher king, right? So for you to become a philosopher king, right, which would be the central political authority of the republic, you would go through a training, a very specific training. So it talks about the education, right, of young people, right? What kind of effects reading poetry would have, on young people, etc. These kinds of things are discussed on the Republic. Um, and it goes over several themes, so it's not restricted to points one and points two, but I would argue I would argue that education, psychology, poetry, kind of lurk on the background. Okay, maybe they were more important at the day. This whole discussion about the role of poetry, etc., was maybe more important on the day, but now when we read it, it's more important to us because of its discussion of moral philosophy. So, what is justice? So, ethics, right? And because of its discussion of political philosophy, right? So, politics. Okay. These are the main three, but most people agree that justice, right, is the the main, thread running through it. Now, there are several visions of justice, okay, in the Republic. And as you know, the main character is Socrates, and he will encounter in you read book one and book two, right? The first two books of the Republic, which are the first two chapters, they were just called books, but they're chapters. Socrates will meet Thrasymachus, Polemarchus, Cephalus, and also he will also meet Adeimantus, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so he will meet, of course, more people, not only these guys here, right? A bunch of other people. But we'll introduce the visions one at a time. So I wanted to start with these three visions of justice. And then the plan for the rest of the lecture is I'll tell you these three visions of justice here. And then I'll try to explain what Plato's vision or Socrates' vision of justice would be. Of course, you would have to read the whole book to get that idea of what Socrates and Plato, right? You won't understand that just from reading the first two chapters, but I'll at least give you an idea of more or less what it would look like. Socrates' vision, okay, but Socrates' vision of justice, we'll look at it later. These three visions I want to look at now are Cephalus and Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus for the time being. Okay. All right. Um, so I just want to read a few quotes. I'm not going to read almost any quotes, but at least for this first lecture. But there's just mostly illustrations. But I read a few, just the most important ones, most central ones. So the first encounter Socrates has is with Cephalus. And Socrates asks at one point, so Capitals, are you saying that it is easier to be just if you're rich? How does justice relate to money? And he says, Capitals says, well, it helps you avoid the wrath of the gods, and it helps you not do injustice to other men. It is difficult to be poor and virtuous. Money is not enough. The character of the human being is also important, but the decent man will not bear old age with poverty very easily. Um, and he presses him, of course. That's what Socrates keeps doing, right? He keeps asking questions, trying to squeeze the answer out of people, to force the debate, right, and try to provide clarity. That's what he's trying to do. There's a purpose, right, and constantly asking the question. But the point is, Socrates thinks that it's very, very difficult to explain what justice is, right? Well, how do you define that concept? That seems very hard. So he keeps telling people, honestly, I don't know the answer. Okay. I really don't know the answer. That's why I'm asking you. And he keeps pressuring, asking people and finding logical holes in their arguments and inconsistencies, and trying to say, okay, that's not what justice is because we understood that there's a problem here. And if we keep searching and searching, eventually we'll find it, hopefully. So that's the idea of dialectics and why Socrates keeps asking people questions all the time, right? So he says, capitalists, I still don't know what justice is. And capitalists will eventually say, well, capitalism is speaking the truth and give back what's owed. So Socrates is going to say, oh, so that's what you're saying, Capitals? I haven't written the whole, obviously, go and read the passage and the whole two books, of course. But, if you read through, he's going to say, oh, really? So that's all it is. So, just to speak the truth. So don't lie. There are two things, right? Don't lie. And then pay back your debts. That's all there is to it. And Capitals is like, yeah, I guess. I mean, also, like, um, as long as you have as long as there's this idea of piety, right, and the idea of pleasing the gods and doing the sacrifices. Okay, so Kepler represents kind of this old ancient view, right, traditional religious of the good life, right, the way to go to heaven or whatever. They didn't have the idea of heaven in Greece, right? They had the idea of Hayden, but it was multiple gods, not one god, right, etc., different kind of religion. But the idea was that you should, as you see here on the on the right hand corner, the person here is about a sacrifice, right, an animal, and Capitulus is doing that in the Republic. He's saying, well, yeah, I guess, I mean, as long as you have money, it's easier to be just, right? And just here is kind of excellent. You have to understand it in that sense. Okay, it's not just in the sense of making the fair decision. It's not just fairness, justice. Okay, it's more than that. It's like excellency. Being completely virtuous. It's also being just as we think about it, but it's even more than that, right? So excellence, the good life. How do you live the good life, right? What is justice? That's the theme here. That's what Socrates is trying to get at. And Gapel is, he's a little bit pressed here by Socrates. Really, that's all there is to it. Speaking the truth and giving back what's owed. And he's going to say, well, yeah, I guess, like as long as you have money, you can pay your debts, right? Because that's wrong. So that wouldn't be just. And as long as you have money, you can sacrifice, um, as many animals as you want. You can buy them, right? If you're wealthy, and sacrifice them, and then you can please the gods. And that's the first idea of what justice is. What it is to be just and to live a good life. And Socrates, there's the I'm not going to get very in much into the details of these arguments and counter arguments because they're quite lengthy and Socrates will, um, Socrates is going to go, especially with the other two characters. I'm not going to talk much about Socrates' reply, but here is quite easy. Socrates, the way Socrates finds it, pokes a hole in Capitalis's argument is quite simple because he says, well, okay, so if you should always give back someone what's owed, so let's think about this example. Imagine you have a friend, right? And your friend, she gives you a sword, right? She lends you the sword, and then in theory, you should give back that person the sword, right? That's what you're saying. That's what justice is. Okay, but what if that person went like crazy that what if that person lost her mind while you had the sword, right? So she just had a mental crackdown and she's not on her senses right now. So when you go back to give her the sword, you're like, oh, here's your sword. And you notice that person is completely, right, mad. Or maybe perhaps you already knew that that person had completely lost it. Perhaps when you get to her house, she's like, who are you? I don't even know who you are. Give me that sword. I'm going to kill you. Okay, that's the idea. What if your friend, um, you know, lend you a sword and go crazy? Should you still go give back the sword? Socrates asked to Cephalus. Then is it always right to give back something? What if, right? Because if you give back the sword to a person who went mentally, had a mental problems in that period, she's clearly going to get the sword and going to kill you. So is that still correct thing to do? And Kepler's going to say, oh no, clearly not. And I understand, like, um, giving back stuff is generally the right thing to do, but not always, right? There's going to be situations where there's not the case. Um, and Socrates, goes, voila, so, so you're wrong. So that's not the definition of justice, right? That's the dynamic that's going to repeat over and over. Socrates says, well, that can't be the right? The complete definition of what justice is and what's the good life, because I just found an example to contradict your definition. If I find one hole in your argument, then that's not the best, right? The best definition of what justice is, and let's try to improve it, right? But Catholics doesn't really want to improve it. He's like, oh, you know what? I'm busy. I just gotta go and sacrifice another animal, and because it doesn't matter, even if he agrees intellectually with Socrates here, it feels like, because he kind of agrees with Socrates and like, yeah, you're right, um, but he doesn't want to stay there and continue debating what the meaning of justice is, because he's convinced that it's just his religious idea, right, is enough for him. He's convinced of that. So he says, well, you're right. I was wrong about my definition of justice. It's not just giving back what's owed. However, you know what? I gotta go and sacrifice an animal and do this and this, go to the rituals and blah blah blah, because that's what I have to do, right? I gotta do right? I gotta pay back to the gods and etc. So the intellectual um, discussion isn't enough for Catholics. He belongs to this older tradition, right, of the traditions and the rituals and sacrifice and etc. And so he says, I'm going to leave you to discuss with my son, and I'm going to get out of here. So that idea of the son, right, and you have the son Paul Marcus. It's the old being written. So we have got to get rid of multiple things here. Socrates is saying, right? Or Plato is saying via Socrates, right? Plato is saying we got to get rid of the old traditions. This idea of justice is to pay back what's owed and sacrifice to the gods, etc. Right? It's not that. It's more than that. And here with Paul and Marcus, you can see that Paul Marcus, he joins in the discussion saying, well, according to Simonides, justice is to give each what's owed, right? So he says, oh, so yes, it is, right? The thing my father was saying is right, because that's what Simonides says. Simonides is an important intellectual here, right? And then what Socrates is going to do here is, well, if I've already got rid of the ancient beliefs and religious ideas, now I got to get rid of Simonides. That is, I got to get rid of these appeals to authority. Okay, first we were making appeals to divinity, appeals to God or other things, right? That's what his father was doing here. That's what Paul Marcus' father was doing, making appeals to God. And then Paul Marcus is going to join the conversation saying, oh, well, if Simonides says that's right, that's what it is, right? And then Socrates is saying, well, he's appealing to Simonides, taking him for granted, right? We can't appeal to, like, even if a person is a very important intellectual or scholar, you can't just say, well, because such a person said this thing, this is definitely happened, definitely true, and we shouldn't even debate it, right? So Socrates is going to do the same, or he's going to try to find a hole on Paul Marcus's vision of justice, right? Um, and what is Paul Marcus's vision of justice? Well, it's a little bit different from his father, right? After they go back and forth a little bit, they arrive at this, right? Socrates. So Paul Marcus, are you saying that justice is doing good to friends and harm to enemies? And Paul Marcus will say, yeah, that's what justice is, right? You help your friends and you hurt the foes. That's what it is. Um, and Socrates, of course, we're going to go through a long debate here with Paul Marcus and try to find reasons why that's not necessarily the case. Um, Essentially that's going to be very clear in the apology, and when we read the apology and Crito the next week. But essentially you'll see that Socrates doesn't believe on the idea of enemies even. He'll argue he doesn't have any enemy, like maybe people don't like me. That's Socrates saying, right? Maybe people don't like me, so maybe I'm their enemy from their perspective, but I don't have any enemies even. I don't, right? um all people are friends, or if they don't want to be my friends, they're not my enemy. That's him saying. So he's basically saying, harming your enemy cannot be justice, okay? Because if you harm someone, you're making that person less excellent, less virtuous, isn't it? So if you hurt someone, is that going to improve that person's life, or is that going to, right, make things even worse for her? Basically is going to say, how can you say that it is just to harm someone when by hurting someone, that makes that person less likely to become just, isn't it? To become excellent and virtuous. So that can't be justice. Whatever justice is, its effects have to be to make people more just. The consequence of justice cannot be to make people more unjust, right? Less just. And he's saying, but if you argue that harming your enemies is what justice is, that's precisely what happens. Well, you harm someone so much that that person is no longer even able, right, to be virtuous at some point, because she's being under so much stress or violence or poverty, whatever it is, after she's been harmed. That how does she get out of that? It becomes even harder, isn't it? So that's Socrates' argument here, right? By making someone less excellent, right? That's when he's talking about the virtue of a horse and the virtue of a dog, and that sounds a bit weird but that's just the language he's using. When he's saying the virtue of a dog, it's the excellence of a dog or a horse. That is, what is it that the dog or the horse are excellent at? Okay, just so you understand that when you're reading, because it's very difficult to read to understand that the first time. But when he's talking with Paul Martin, saying, what is the virtue of the dog or a virtue of a horse? Well, the virtue of a dog would be that the dog is a good friend, right? Is loyal, keeps you company, is entertaining, is cute, friendly, sweet, etc. Those are the virtues, right? Horses, the virtue of the horse is it's a good transportation mechanism. It's strong and fast, and you can travel quite quickly, right? At least relative to walking, it's a very good means of transportation, right? So that would be the virtue of the dog, right? And so on and so forth. So he's basically saying, imagine this: if the virtue, right, of excellence from the of dogs or and animals in general, if you harm those animals, are they going to become better or worse at right at performing whatever it is that they are good at? And obviously they're going to become worse. So he's saying you cannot harm your enemies, right? Because that will make they'll make them less excellent, therefore less just. But yeah, so that's just so you understand, because otherwise you can't. So you could think about that, in those terms. And the thing is, if the horse, what makes it virtuous is that it can transport people strong and fast. If the what makes the dog, the virtue of the dog, if that is to be loyal, to be right, companionship, etc., then what is the virtue of the person, of the human being, right? Socrates is going to say justice. You see, that's what it is, right? What makes us us is justice, that we can be just, we can be moral human beings, right? We can be moral beings and make those moral decisions, right? What makes a dog is that it's right, your friend and your pet, etc. What makes a human is that a human can be just, is a moral animal, right? So that's the point he's making here. So by harming the another individual, you're diminishing that central characteristic of it, that and that's justice at the end of the day. Um, okay. And so and then the conversation moves through Thrasymachus, and interesting because, as I said, right, Socrates never replies, never answers what justice is. He just keeps asking questions and asking other people what it is, but he doesn't answer it himself, if you notice. So Thrasymachus says, enough, come on, Socrates, enough's enough. Tell us what it is. And then Socrates, very humble, right? That's what I told you. How can a man answer who does not know and does not profess to know? You, on the other hand, are wise, Thrasymachus. Why don't you, best of men, tell us what justice is? And Thrasymachus is going to say justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. In other words, that might is right, right? If you have the money and the power, you can determine what the laws are. Thrasymachus is basically saying that's all, all of that discussion is kind of useless, honestly, because you don't need to, philosophize that much or think about virtues or think about, what the different virtues could be and whether one virtue is more important than the other or whether there should be a harmony between different virtues, etc. All of that's stupid, Thrasymachus is saying. All that matters is who controls society, right? So he's basically making a mistake from Socrates' perspective because he doesn't realize that justice, as Socrates is trying to understand it, is what the laws and the system ought to be, not what they are, right? And that's obviously clearly different from the justice system as it is, the laws as they are, right? There's a famous maxim by David Hume where he says, you can't derive an ought from an is, right? It's not because the material world is like this that you can say, well, that's how it should be, or that's right. You could have a perfect description of reality, but what does that tell you about what the world should be like? Right? Maybe it should be as it is. Maybe it should be completely different. You just can't, derive this normative assessment by your positive evaluation. There's a difference between normative and positive. Thrasymachus is missing that completely in my eyes. And that's the problem with his definition, right? Even if it's true that the laws are always determined by the elite, even if that's true, because it's not clear, right? But if the whole history of the world is just that, the powerful gaining at the expense of the weak, that kind of argument, even if that's true, there's still the case that's just the laws as they are, or the justice system. That has nothing to do as, justice as a normative idea, not as a positive one, but as a normative one, right? What laws ought to be, what they should be, not what they are. So these are completely different things. And again, here Socrates is, debate is quite long with Thrasymachus, and I'm not going to get into the details of Socrates' counter argument. But what's more important, I think, to us is the different visions that um, these discussions hold, because they're gonna be they are echoed in the history of political philosophy. So we're gonna see with Machiavelli a very similar vision of Thrasymachus here, right? And Thomas Hobbes as well as Machiavelli holds a vision of individuals, similar of human nature and of morality, which is a little bit similar to Thrasymachus.